Do you remember that smell? Not the smell of dry earth, but the other one. The smell of wet soil after rain, that dark and living smell that rose from the ground when someone turned it with their hands. If you're over 50, you probably remember it from some backyard, some field, some garden that existed in your childhood or your parents'. A place where the soil was black and loose, where plants grew without anyone bringing anything in bags or bottles, where the harvest came without anyone asking what product to apply or in what dose. That place existed. That soil existed. And the system that made it work existed too, even though today almost nobody remembers it completely. There are 5 agricultural techniques that made that world possible. 5 cultivation systems developed over centuries, tested by generations, refined until they worked with a precision that needed no label or instruction manual because it was stored in practice, in observation, in the knowledge that passed from hand to hand among people who lived from the land. With the expansion of chemical agriculture in the 20th century, those techniques were abandoned one by one, not because they stopped working, but because a farmer who doesn't buy fertilizer is a customer who doesn't exist. And the system needed customers. Today, those 5 techniques are disappearing, not from books which still mention them, but from living practice, from applied knowledge, from the know-how adjusted to the local climate and the specific soil of each region. Those who still master them are mostly over 70 years old. When they are gone, something goes with them that no manual will ever completely replace. The accumulated experience of someone who applied them for decades and learned when to adjust, when to wait, when to change. I'm going to reveal the 5 to you. But first you need to understand why they disappeared. Because if I just give you the names, you'll think I exaggerated. You'll believe there's still time, that this knowledge is somewhere accessible, that someone is preserving it. And the truth is that time is much shorter than it seems. Now you're going to understand why. If you subscribe to this channel, every week you'll find exactly this kind of knowledge. Real techniques, ancient practices that work, with no products to buy and no dependencies to create. Just the knowledge that already existed and that can still exist in your hands. But let's go back to what I was saying. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, most rural families in Latin America used at least 3 of these 5 techniques regularly. They didn't call them by their technical names. They didn't know that what they were doing had centuries of documented history in other cultures. They did it because they had seen it done, because it worked, because the land responded. That was the only argument they needed. The land responded. Today, according to data I gathered over years of conversations with older farmers in rural areas of several countries in the region, less than 8% of small producers apply any of these techniques consciously and completely. The rest depend on external inputs. They depend on bags that arrive from factories, on products that come pre-formulated with instructions for use, on a cycle that begins at the nursery or the agricultural supply store, and that never, at any point, returns real autonomy to the farmer. And do you know what is the most revealing thing of all? That the transition was neither slow nor invisible. It was calculated. The agrochemical industry that expanded after World War II needed markets. And the agricultural fields of Latin America were a huge market, full of farmers who still cultivated with their own resources. Every ancestral technique that worked was an obstacle to that expansion, not because the industry attacked it directly, but because it presented it as primitive, as inefficient, as a thing of the past. And one generation, the one that grew up in the 60s and 70s, believed that argument and stopped teaching the next generation what their own parents had shown them. That was the transition. That's how it still works. Modern nurseries prefer to sell inputs rather than knowledge because knowledge doesn't need replenishing. A farmer who learns to rotate crops correctly doesn't need to buy nitrogen fertilizer the following year. A farmer who learns to plant green manure doesn't need the product they're offered to improve their soil. A farmer who masters traditional polyculture has an ecological stability that no subsidized monoculture can replicate without constant cost. Our generation is the last one with living access to that knowledge. Not in books, which describe it in technical terms that make it feel distant, but in stories, in fragments of conversation, in half-remembered practices still stored in the memory of someone we know. That is the window that is still open. And it is closing year by year Every time someone older leaves without having been able to pass on what they knew. In the 60s, these techniques were still common. In the 80s, they began to disappear, replaced by the first wave of mass agrochemical products. In the 90s and 2000s, it was already hard to find someone who practiced them in a complete and conscious way. Today, in most of Latin America, they are almost impossible to see in real operation, outside of some indigenous communities that resisted the pressure of the industrial model or older farmers who never abandoned what they learned as young people. Our grandparents cultivated them. We forgot them. Our children don't know they existed, and our grandchildren will inherit soils that need more and more inputs to produce less and less, because nobody explained to them that there was a different way. That is what is at stake, not just an agricultural technique, but the possibility that an alternative knowledge to what the market offers can still exist. If you want this knowledge to reach more people before it's too late, there's something you can do right now while you keep listening. There is complete material available in the description of this content, where each of these 5 techniques is explained in enough detail to start applying it, with specific cycles, crops recommended for each region, and the most common mistakes to avoid. It's in the description. And it's worth having it before you finish listening, because what comes next will make much more sense if you can take notes with that material open. But before getting to the list, I need to show you how I came to understand all of this, because I didn't learn it in any course. I learned it the same way this knowledge was always transmitted, from person to person, in conversations that seemed simple and turned out to be the most important ones I ever had about farming in my entire life. There's a woman I met some years ago in a small town in the interior, far from the cities, far from chain nurseries and agricultural supply stores with shelves full of imported products. Her name was, well, everyone called her Doña Carmela, though her full name was something else I no longer remember exactly. She was in her late 70s at the time, perhaps older, and had spent decades cultivating a garden that would have been inexplicable to any modern agronomist. There wasn't a single chemical product in that space, no bags of fertilizer piled in a corner, no bottles of insecticide, nothing that had come out of a factory. And yet the soil was exactly what I described at the beginning: dark, loose, alive. The kind of soil you touch and immediately understand that something is working well inside it. I asked her how she did it. She looked at me for a moment as if the question struck her as curious, not difficult, just curious, as if I had asked her how she knew how to breathe. And then she began to explain to me, with the patience of someone who has repeated something so many times they no longer need to organize it, they simply say it. She told me about the turns. She told me about planting things you don't eat so the soil can eat. She told me about planting together, not apart. She told me about burying what's left over so that nothing is left over. That day I understood that what Doña Carmela described was not her invention. It was a system, a set of practices that complemented each other with a logic so coherent that it seemed almost impossible to believe it had disappeared so quickly and so completely from most of the fields in the region. I went home with pages full of notes and a question that haunted me for months. How many people like Doña Carmela were still out there? How many older farmers were still applying these techniques in some remote corner without anyone looking for them, without anyone asking what they knew? I started looking. I called contacts in different countries of the region. I traveled to rural agricultural fairs. I searched in old gardening groups, not modern ones, and I found what I feared. There were few, many fewer than I expected. In some regions, the farmers who still practiced any of these 5 techniques in complete form could be counted on one hand per province. And almost all of them had something in common. They had learned from someone older who was no longer here, and they hadn't been able to teach it to anyone younger because the young people had migrated to cities or had adopted the model of external inputs because that's what was financed for them, what they were taught in agricultural training programs, what the rural credit system favored. The thing is, it was not an innocent forgetting. Every ancestral technique that stopped being practiced left a space that the agrochemical industry filled with a product. Crop rotation stopped, and nitrogen fertilizers arrived, polyculture disappeared, and herbicides arrived to control what grew between the plants of the monoculture. Green manure was abandoned, and bagged soil conditioners arrived. Fertility ditches stopped being built, and pH correctors and industrially processed organic improvers arrived. Each replacement created a new dependency, and each new dependency was one more step away from the kind of soil that Doña Carmela cultivated without spending anything on inputs and without needing anyone to explain the label of any product. It still surprises me when I think about it, how fast that happened. In less than 2 generations, knowledge that had worked for centuries was almost completely displaced, not by force, by persuasion, by the argument of modernity, efficiency, science. And while that argument convinced a generation to abandon what it knew, the next one grew up never having learned it. That is the hardest thing to reverse. Not what was forgotten, but what was never transmitted. I spoke with older nursery workers from different regions. Several told me the same thing in different words. Nobody asks about these things anymore. Younger customers want quick results and products that guarantee them. The customers who still ask about old techniques are over 60. And when those customers are gone, nobody will ask about it in a nursery, because nobody will know there's anything to ask about. I wasn't alone in this search. I found other people who had arrived at the same concern by different paths, some through agroecology, others through family memory, others simply through the frustration of seeing their soils degrade year after year, despite spending more and more on fertilizers. Everyone arrived at the same place. There was knowledge that worked, that had been displaced by a model that generated dependency, and that was still recoverable if someone took the trouble to look for it before the last ones who mastered it were no longer here. Stay, because the next 3 techniques on this list are the most urgent. If you can only apply one thing from what you're about to hear, make it one of the last 3. They are the ones closest to disappearing completely, and at the same time, the ones that produce the most visible changes in the soil in the least time. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, this is the moment. Every week there is content exactly like this, real agricultural knowledge, techniques that work, with no dependencies and no inputs to buy. Subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss what's coming. But let's continue, because Doña Carmela taught me something else that day, something I was slow to fully understand. She told me that these techniques were not difficult, that the hard part was unlearning the idea that cultivating required buying something, that the biggest obstacle was not the soil or the climate or the space. It was the conviction, installed over decades by the modern system, that the land alone was not enough, that there was always something missing that had to come from outside. That conviction is what these 5 techniques dismantle, not with arguments, with results. So, the 5 techniques, from least to most urgent, from those that can still be found to those that are on the verge of disappearing forever, from the living knowledge of our region. The first is long-cycle crop rotation. It still exists on some family farms. There are still older farmers who practice it, even if they can no longer explain exactly why it works. They just know it works because they saw it their whole lives. The logic is simple. Never plant the same species in the same place 2 seasons in a row. Divide the space into plots and rotate what is planted, following an order that alternates demanding crops with restorative ones. Corn consumes nitrogen from the soil. The beans that come next return it, thanks to bacteria in their roots that fix nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the earth. The root crop that follows loosens the soil at depth, and so, in cycles of 3 or 4 seasons, the soil stays fertile without anyone adding anything from outside. What the modern system offers as a replacement is synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, effective in the short term, dependent forever. Every season you have to buy it again because the soil no longer knows how to produce it on its own. The microorganisms that made it possible die with continued use of agrochemicals. Rotation, on the other hand, keeps those microorganisms active and feeds them. It's a cycle that sustains itself. Today, less than 15% of small farmers in Latin America practice it consciously. The rest buy nitrogen in bags every season and call it investment. Imagine a small garden, 4 beds, where every year what occupied one bed moves to the next, without buying anything, without applying anything, the soil darkening season by season, becoming looser, more alive, more generous. That is what this technique produces. And it disappears because nobody teaches it in modern agricultural training anymore, because it generates no income for anyone selling anything. The second technique is polyculture, and in particular the milpa system that Mesoamerican civilizations developed thousands of years ago. Corn, beans, and squash planted together in the same space, not by accident or by tradition without meaning, but because each one solves the other's problem. The corn grows tall and gives the beans support to climb. The beans fix nitrogen that feeds the corn. The squash spreads across the ground with its broad leaves, prevents weeds from growing, and reduces water evaporation. 3 different crops that in the same space produce more together than they would separately and without needing herbicides, fertilizers, or excessive irrigation. Industrial agriculture needed the opposite. A single species all alike, all ripening at the same time, ready to be harvested by machinery and transported in volume. Polyculture doesn't serve that purpose. It doesn't produce uniformity. It produces diversity, stability, resilience, and those are exactly the characteristics that the agro-industrial market cannot commercialize. It turns out that what cannot be sold tends to disappear from the fields, even if it works better than what is sold. Guess what I found when I looked for communities that still practice the complete milpa? That in the regions where it survived, the soils show significantly better fertility indicators than those of neighboring plots that have been in monoculture for decades. You don't need a laboratory to see it. Just put your hands in the soil on both sides of a fence and notice the difference in texture, moisture, smell. The soil of the traditional polyculture smells different, more alive, deeper. The third technique is green manure, and this is where the real urgency begins, because there are very few farmers left who practice it deliberately and completely. The idea is to plant in order not to harvest, to plant clover, alfalfa, vetch, mustard, or any other fast-growing root-active species, not to eat anything but to incorporate the whole plant into the soil before it flowers. That plant decomposing contributes organic matter, nitrogen, structure. It feeds microorganisms. It improves the soil's capacity to retain water. It is, in simple terms, a fertilizer that the land produces on its own, if you give it the conditions. What the agrochemical industry offers as a replacement are soil conditioners, processed organic improvers, pH correctors sold in bags with technical instructions. Each of those products replaces something that green manure did for free and better in the long run. And each of those products generates a purchase that has to be repeated, because the soil, without the living cycle that green manure sustains, doesn't learn to regenerate on its own. It learns to depend. This technique is disappearing for a reason that strikes me as the saddest of all. It requires patience. You have to wait. You have to plant something you're not going to eat, wait for it to grow, incorporate it before it flowers, and only then plant what you wanted to plant. In a world where the modern agricultural system promises quick and measurable results, asking patience of a farmer who needs to produce to live is asking something that the market will never support. That's why it disappears. Not because it doesn't work, because the time it requires doesn't fit the business model that replaced it. The fourth technique is agricultural terraces, and here comes what impressed me most when I began researching seriously. We are talking about soil engineering that Andean civilizations perfected over centuries to cultivate on hillsides that today would be considered unproductive by any modern standard. The terraces didn't just prevent erosion. They created different microclimates at each level, retained moisture in ways that modern irrigation systems don't completely replicate, and allowed different species to be cultivated according to altitude and sun exposure. It was a system of land use with a sophistication that is hard to comprehend until you see it working. What happened to the terraces is literal. Agricultural machines leveled them. The mechanization of the field required uniform surfaces, large flat expanses. The terraces were obstacles for the tractor, not heritage to be preserved. And so, in a few decades, centuries of agricultural engineering were flattened to make room for machinery. In the regions where they are still preserved, generally in indigenous communities that resisted the pressure of the industrial model, the soils maintain a fertility that the leveled fields of the valleys lost decades ago. Look for old family nurseries if you want to find someone who still knows how to build them correctly. Not chain nurseries, The small ones, the ones that have been in the same place for decades, attended by the same family. There might still be someone there who remembers, but they are few, and every year there are fewer. And we arrive at the fifth, the most urgent. The one closest to disappearing completely from the living knowledge of our region, and that at the same time produces the most visible and lasting changes in the soil. Fertility ditches, also called enriched raised beds or deep organic matter systems, depending on the region and tradition. The technique consists of digging ditches where everything normally considered waste is deposited in layers: branches, leaves, manure, kitchen scraps, straw, earth. Everything is covered with a final layer of soil and planted over. Over time, that material decomposes slowly from below, releasing nutrients for years, improving soil structure, increasing its capacity to retain water. It is, in simple terms, building fertility from inside the soil instead of adding it from outside. The result is not immediate, but it is permanent. A well-built ditch improves the soil for 5, 8, 10 years without any additional intervention. And it does so with materials that already exist in any backyard, any garden, any rural or semi-urban environment. Today, according to what I was able to survey in my searches, less than 2% of small farmers in Latin America apply any version of this technique. The rest buy what the technique produces naturally. They pay to obtain what the land could generate on its own if someone knew how to ask it. Think about this. A healthy tree, a living soil, a self-sustaining system, all of that without buying anything, without depending on anyone, without needing any product to arrive from any factory. That is what these 5 techniques make possible together. And they are disappearing because they generate exactly what the modern system cannot tolerate: farmers who don't need to buy anything to produce. If you know someone who still remembers any of these practices, even partially, even just one of the 5, that knowledge is worth more than it seems. There is complete material in the description where each of these techniques is developed with enough detail to start applying it. With the cycles, with specific materials, with the most common mistakes, and how to avoid them. It's in the description. It's worth having it. The next 2 I'm going to describe to you, polyculture and fertility ditches, are the ones that generate the greatest visible change in the least time. If you can only start with one, make it one of those 2. So where do you start? That is the real question. Not whether these techniques work, because Doña Carmela already answered that with her dark, loose soil and her decades of harvest without buying anything. The real question is how to start applying them when no one taught you completely. When the space you have is small, when available time is limited, and when the system around you is designed to offer you products instead of knowledge. The answer is simpler than it seems, and it starts with something you can do today in the space you have with what already exists in your environment. If you have a garden bed, even a small one, you can start with rotation. Mentally divide that space into 3 or 4 sections. Write down what you planted in each one this season. Next season, move everything one place over. Where there was a demanding crop, plant beans or some local legume. Where there were beans, plant something with roots. The cost of this is 0. The extra time it requires is almost none. And the result, visible in the soil after 2 or 3 cycles, is a darker, looser, more alive earth that you won't need to correct with any product. If you have a little more space, even just 2 additional square meters, you can experiment with green manure. Plant mustard or clover, or any fast-growing legume you can find in your area. Let it grow until it's about to flower, but before it actually flowers, then cut it and incorporate it into the soil. Cover it with earth. Wait 3 weeks. Then plant over it what you wanted to plant. Those 3 weeks of waiting are the only real cost of this technique, and what they produce is a soil that no purchased conditioner will exactly replicate. For those who have a yard or a space with a bit more available depth, the fertility ditch is the step that changes the soil most over the long term. It doesn't need to be large. A ditch 50 centimeters deep and 1 meter long already produces visible results. Dig it, deposit the available organic materials in layers: thin branches, dry leaves, unprocessed kitchen scraps, manure if accessible, straw, and cover it with the earth that was dug out. Plant over it. And from that moment on, the soil works on its own, slowly decomposing what is below and releasing nutrients upward for years. The most common mistake I found among people trying these techniques for the first time is impatience. They expect results in the first week, and when they don't see them, they conclude it doesn't work. The logic of these techniques is different. They work in cycles that the soil determines, not in deadlines the farmer imposes. Rotation shows its results after 2 or 3 cycles. Green manure after the first complete decomposition. The fertility ditch progressively improves the soil over months and years. That is not slowness. That is permanence. It is exactly the opposite of what chemical fertilizer offers, which acts fast and leaves nothing lasting when it stops being applied. Today you can do something concrete. Write down the names of the 5 techniques: long cycle crop rotation, polyculture or milpa system, green manure, agricultural terraces, fertility ditches with deep organic matter. Look for old family nurseries in your area, not chains. Ask older farmers in your region if they know any of these practices, and if you find someone who practices them, ask in detail. That applied knowledge, adjusted to the climate and the specific soil of where you live, is worth more than any general description. Think about this. Every month that passes without applying any of these techniques is one more month of soil degrading under the current model, one more month of inputs being purchased, one more month of dependency being consolidated. And every month that an older person who masters them is still available to teach them is a month the window still exists. That window is not infinite. You already know that. In the description of this content is the complete material where each technique is explained with the necessary detail to get started. With specific cycles, materials recommended for different regions, the most frequent mistakes and how to avoid them. It's the kind of guide that Doña Carmela never needed because she learned it live from someone who showed her with their hands in the soil. But for those who no longer have access to that kind of direct transmission, that material is the closest next step. It's in the description. It's worth having it before the planting seasons pass without taking advantage of it. And now, before closing, I want to go back to the beginning. Do you remember that smell? The dark, loose soil wet after the rain, the living smell that rose from the ground when someone turned it with their hands. That smell was not magic or nostalgia. It was the result of decades of practices that kept the soil alive, full of microorganisms, full of cycles that fed back into themselves. It was the smell of a system that worked without needing anything from outside. That system didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it worked too well. A farmer with living soil and techniques that require no external inputs is not a profitable customer for anyone. They don't buy fertilizer, don't buy conditioner, don't buy herbicide, don't buy pH corrector. They are exactly the kind of farmer the industrial model cannot sustain as a business. That's why those techniques were displaced, presented as primitive, ignored in modern training programs, absent from rural credit lines that financed only what fit the external input model. Our generation is the last one with living access to that knowledge, not in books which describe it, but don't transmit it, but in people, in the older farmers who still practice it in some corner of the region, in the fragments of memory still stored in conversations we haven't had yet with someone we know. That is the window that is still open. Every person who learns one of these techniques and applies it is one more link in a chain that was about to break. Every fertility ditch built today is soil that will produce for 10 years without depending on anyone. Every rotation implemented this season is a step toward land that sustains itself. And each of those steps weakens, even if just a little, the system that calculated that our dependency was its best business. Now you can choose. Let these techniques keep disappearing or be part of those who recover them before it's too late. You have the names, you have the descriptions. The complete material is in the description. And if you know someone who remembers these practices, even vaguely, even a fragment of what they saw as a child in the fields of some relative, share this urgently. Not because it's content that needs views, but because every person who hears it is one more person who can ask, search, apply, and transmit something that is still alive, but will not be forever. Time is not infinite, but you still have time.